So, first things first, want to talk about the South Carolina game that happened on Wednesday. For those of you that watched the pod, my prediction was somewhere like 85-69, I think is what I officially put out on my thread before the game. Really, the game was about like I expected. In the end, right? At the beginning of the game, Alabama was really clicking on all cylinders as it came to the first half. At the very beginning of the first half, they had a slow start. We talked about that in the post-game space. I think that part of the reason behind that is I don't know if Jaron Stevenson is the best offensive weapon to start the games. I understand why he's in there from a defensive perspective, and he does give us a lot from a defensive perspective. But I don't know if the spacing is quite there when you're running him, Nelson, and Cliff together. So we had a little bit of a slow start to start the first half. Alabama ends up picking it up, ends up playing pretty well, and then Alabama ends up, going up. I believe it was 17 at the half. Then Alabama comes out second half, again another slow start, and Alabama went on some shooting slumps. There were some 50-50 balls that maybe went the opposite way, or just everything just wasn't going and flowing as smoothly as it was in the first half, and that caused Alabama to only win this game by 20. Alabama probably is about if they're playing their best, they probably could beat this team by 25 to 30, and probably should have in this game, right? I even put out a tweet kind of middle of the game or toward the end of the game, like, hey, I don't know if my score prediction was high enough, and then it was almost perfect, right? If it wasn't for Aiden Sherrill 3 to in the game, I would have been 1 point off. And I think that overall that Alabama just has to learn, and Nate's talked about this at length, has to learn about how to keep your foot on the gas on defense and on offense when you're up, right? There was a moment that a lot of people are going to talk about, and there's been a lot of talk on Twitter about it. Nate was even asked about it, where he did a 5-for-5 platoon swap, right? He was mad at his starters when they came out in the second half. Like maybe 2 minutes into the half, he immediately does a platoon swap, brings in a whole brand new 5. Then, maybe a minute and a half into that, Darion Reed does not get back in transition. He calls timeout and meets Darion at midcourt, just railing him, right? Really screaming at him. Darion obviously takes the coaching very well, pats Nate on the back. Nate even said after the fact that it apparently also was on Chris Youngblood, and that Chris had owned up to it in the film room when they were talking about it after the fact. But Darion was the one that really got laid into during the game, and it was Nate really trying to set the tone and be like, hey, no matter what, we can't take plays off on defense, and this is what we expect. To note, Darion did not get pulled after that, right? Nate called the timeout. Nate really laid into him, but Darion did not get pulled after that. He played for like the next 5-6 minutes. He ended up getting pulled later, but it was more of just, getting him rest and, normal rotation style pulling. It was not a situation where he was pulled due to the issue that happened on defense or the lack of coaching or whatever, right? It was Nate just, getting him the rest as you typically would with a player when you're as deep as Alabama is, right? I think in this South Carolina game, it was, from South Carolina's perspective, it was exactly what we expected. They just did not have the scoring missing Miles Stute. They really couldn't do a whole lot from a scoring perspective. They end up going 3 of 14 from 3. They shoot just 50% from 2. Jacoby Wright, was their leading scorer with 20. Nick Pringle, to his credit, had a pretty good game, in the return against Alabama. They had to play some guys that don't typically play a lot. And we knew that was going to happen, right? Especially missing Stute. And they have a pretty thin rotation. Right? So because of that, they had to play some guys that are just not accustomed to playing the amount of minutes that they needed to play. And in general, South Carolina, I think, is just going to be undermatched this season, right? I think that South Carolina is going to be near the bottom of the SEC this season, with or without Stute, right? And I think that it's just going to be a situation of this team is going to be clawing to try to see if they can make like the NIT. If they were to go on a run, could they make the NCAA tournament? Sure. But I do think it's going to be pretty tough. South Carolina also has, one of the only like kind of bad losses so far this season against North Florida early in the season. That's one of the only like truly bad losses that the conference has. And so I do think that South Carolina is on that trajectory to definitely lose some more games. They also have an absolute brutal stretch coming up. It obviously started with Alabama, but they play Auburn next week. Today actually. Vandy, Oklahoma, Florida, Mississippi State, Georgia, A&M, Kentucky. Right, they have a very, very tough schedule here at the very beginning of their conference slate. So I do think that eventually South Carolina may figure something out and may be able to go on a little bit of a run toward the end of conference play. But I think that without Stute and the type of schedule which they have early season, I think it's going to be really, really tough for Carolina to get the wins that they're going to need to try to make the NCAA tournament. So I do think this is like an NIT team at best. And I think that's where Carolina is going to be for this season, right? The things I do want to talk about when you're looking at Alabama that I thought that really, stood out about it. Alabama actually shot pretty well from three. We talked about this in the pregame video. Was Alabama going to be able to put up a ton of threes, right? When you look at South Carolina, they don't give up a lot of threes. They're like 10th in the country at number of threes they allow like you to take. And it happened, right? Alabama only takes 19 threes in this game. They go 8 of 19 though, right? So 42%. If you've seen the percentages Alabama's been putting up this year, you will absolutely take 40%. And because of how good they are from two, it actually would not surprise me, especially missing Wrightsell. And we'll talk in a minute about how we're also probably going to be missing Millette for the rest of the season, or potentially missing some of your better three-point shooters. It would not shock me if Alabama's three-point numbers this season don't need to be closer to 30. They need to be closer to 25 because you're so good from two and you're shooting such a high percentage from two that you just want to take your absolute best three-point shots and then really, clean up on the inside the paint and in the glass because that's where Alabama's been most successful this season. Another game, Alabama shoots 60% from two, not even close to one of their best from 2-point, but against a really good front court in Nick Pringle and Colin Murray-Boyles, you'll take it, and Alabama wins this game, right? So, like I said, that's the big ones you want to talk about. I think that if you're going to look at people and like, hey, this specific player played really well for Alabama, I think that there's 2 to 3 people you look at. Number one is Aiden Holloway, right? And I put out a tweet, and I truly believe this. When Aiden is playing his game and is playing within himself, he's as good as it comes, right? There was a moment in this game where he took like a bump, like to give himself, I don't know why he took the bump. I don't know if he was trying to draw a foul or what. Ends up putting up a three, nothing but net. He did take a couple of mid-ranges. The first one he made, so Nate left him in. The second one he missed and immediately got pulled. So not sure what that was all about, but, obviously we don't want him taking a ton, especially the type of mid-ranges he was taking. But, it happens. It's not the most surprising thing ever. When somebody gets in their zone and gets feeling it, it would not shock me if that happens. But Aiden Holloway, again, I think that the speed at which he can bring, the finishing he brings around the rim is really big, right? I know Jacob Pickle put a tweet out about it, about how the big difference in Aiden from last season to this season is actually the 2-point percentage. If you look at Aiden's 2-point percentage, last season it sat at 34.5%. Or, sorry, 35%, 34.9. This season it currently sits at 60.5, right? That's just an absolutely huge difference. And when you're looking at a guy the size of Aiden, that ability to finish at over 60% from two, that's just huge, right? And so I think that's really the spot that when you look at Aiden, obviously he's one of our best three-point shooters, but what he brings near the rim is also really, really important. Then, obviously, you got to talk about Mark Sears, right? Mark Sears is looking like the Mark Sears All-American that we thought he could be and should be. He started slow early this season, but this is the Mark Sears you know and love. 22 points. Really did not, really didn't feel like he was playing with, he was playing within himself the whole game, right? He gets 6 assists. He did have a couple of turnovers in this one, which I know last game he had 10 assists and no turnovers, but 16 assists to 3 turnovers in the last 2 games. You'll live with that. Mark is just back playing to the guy that we know he can be, and it really feels like he's letting the game come to him. I do also think it's helping him a little bit to not have to play the 40 minutes he was playing last season. He did this in 30 minutes. He was the only guy to play over 23 minutes on the team. So I think that his ability to not have to play the amount of minutes, and to not have to because of the substitutions that we have, I think that that's really, really big for him. And then the other guy that I want to mention is Cliff Amore, right? Cliff, over the last couple of games, I think is really starting to learn what Alabama wants to do with him from an offensive perspective, like rolling to the hoop with more slams. And I think that he's just becoming a little bit more productive from an offensive perspective for Alabama. And that's huge, right? When you have somebody that can catch the lobs, that can roll to the basket, that can help rebound. He leads the team in offensive rebounds with 3 in this game. I think that that's something that you really have to talk about, because that's something that will help Alabama throughout the season, right? Especially, he was big playing against Colin Murray-Boyles and Nick Pringle in this game, but you're going to continually face better and better big men throughout the course of the season, right? Janai Broom's on the schedule. You've got plenty of other guys on the schedule, and Cliff getting more comfortable, not only from a defensive perspective, but from an offensive perspective, will allow you to play him more in those games. And I think that that's something that Alabama's going to need, because I think that Alabama is at its best when Grant Nelson's at the 4, right? That's the really important thing, is Cliff playing lets Grant move to the 4, and he's a mismatch against almost all 4s. And since he's that mismatch, you really need to be able to play Grant, or be able to play Cliff. Obviously, Aiden Sherrill is somebody that also can give you some minutes. I know Mohamed Diabate was also really, really, really big in this game in his defense against Colin Murray-Boyles. Diabate as a small ball 5 was still playing Grant at the 4, also is really helpful. But at the end of the day, the importance of Cliff, the importance of Mo, the importance of Aiden at times is to be able to play Grant at the 4, because as an offensive weapon, Grant at the 4 is so much better than Grant at the 5 as an offensive weapon, right? Grant has the ability to defend the 5s at times. We saw that last season in the Final Four run, but his offense is much better when he's going against 4s. So that's what I wanted to talk about when you're looking at the South Carolina game. I know that gives us a little bit of an idea as to what I think happened and how Alabama was able to win this game and be successful.